Hello, and welcome to Reardon Mansion State Historic Park's Lunchtime Lecture. I'm Nikki Lober, and I am the Park Manager here. And today's topic is Timber Tales, Flagstaff's Arizona Lumber and Timber Company. And it's exciting to be able to share this information for you, and I hope you all find it valuable. Well, let's dive in. So, got to start presentations with why we're here in Flagstaff. It's the San Francisco Peaks. If it wasn't for the water available on our mountain, we would not have a town here. And that is so important to the beginnings of this town and having a sustainable community here. And our town started off with not a lot going on. It started off with people passing through, with miners heading to the Grand Canyon to do some prospecting. And also it started with some homesteading, some farming happening in the area. Some of the other industries that were in the area, of course, cattle and sheep ranching. But our biggest industry to start off our town was the lumber industry. And Platt Klein really said it well. He said, if Flagstaff was fathered by the railroad, then its mother was the lumber industry, nurturing our town. Now, the Flagstaff itself was not a planned town. When the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad was making their plans and building this railroad across the country, they chose different locations that they were planning for towns and train stops. Flagstaff was only supposed to be a water stop. It wasn't supposed to be a town. And one of the reasons why it became more of a town was, of course, because of the lumber mill, but also because the railroad got held up at Diablo Canyon. It took longer to get this bridge built than they had planned. So the tie cutters and the railroad track layers, they had moved ahead, were running the track further out, and made a settlement here in what became the town of Flagstaff. The train came through in the summer of 1882. This was not the first train station, but within 2 weeks of that train coming through, Edward Eyre had opened the Eyre Lumber Company. Got here a little ahead of it, could only get his equipment as far as that Diablo Canyon, had to haul the rest of it to this Flagstaff location by wagons. And Eyre got the contract to supply the railroad ties for that Atlantic and Pacific Railroad because he outbid his competitors, knowing that he had a ponderosa pine forest here to use. He didn't have to pay for shipping to get the railroad ties here. And Eyre employed as many as 500 employees. He also had a contract with the Mexican Central Railroad, but he was not here in Flagstaff. He was back in the Chicago area. So, he was having trouble finding a good person to run this mill for him. And he met Matt Riordan, Dennis Matthew Riordan, Matt Riordan, through some letters. Matt was the Indian agent at Fort Defiance, and Eyre wrote to him concerning some materials from the Navajo Nation for the Chicago World's Fair. And Matt's letter impressed him in such a manner that Eyre inquired about him with the Secretary of the Interior, and then asked Matt to meet him and offered him a job at Flagstaff, managing as general manager of the Eyre Lumber Company. Matt sees the potential here in this brand new little town of Flagstaff and encourages his two younger brothers to follow him west to help him run this mill. Michael, in the center, arrives first. He actually comes west not to help out at the mill, but instead to recover from tuberculosis. He takes a temporary job as a secretary at the mill and ends up being secretary of the company for the remainder of his life. Tim sees the business potential and arrives here in Flagstaff, and Matt puts him in charge of a couple different operations. And the three brothers end up running the mill for many years. By 1887, Eyre had fulfilled his contract obligations and was looking to get rid of this little lumber mill. And he offers Matt a job elsewhere, but Matt offers to buy the mill instead. Eyre agrees, gives him a fair price of only $145,000 and a great payment plan, making it possible for Matt to buy the mill. Right after he buys it, though, the mill burns down. Fortunately, he wasted no time at all to get insurance set up, so they quickly rebuilt. And they get another incredible opportunity. The Mineral Belt Railroad was being built from Flagstaff down to the Globe, Miami area to connect with those mining communities. But that railroad went bankrupt, and Matt and his brothers were in a position that they bought at auction the locomotive, 10 boxcars, 20 flat cars, and 35 miles of track. And that 35 miles of track run south right through the middle of their timber rights. So great opportunity. They purchased it and created the CARI, the Central Arizona Railway. This was their logging operation. This is how they brought the trees in from the forest. And there was two different operations going on with the lumber company. There was in town, Milltown, shortened up to Milton. Michael Reardon is given the claim that it was he that named it Milton. So this is in town, and this is where the lumber mill is at. And then you also have out in the forest, Camp number 1. Sometimes there was Camp number 2, Camp number 3, Camp number 4, but there was always a Camp number 1. And this is where most of the work was happening. Now, we're really lucky we actually have some firsthand account of what was happening out there in the forest. Charlotte Hall worked for Out West magazine as a writer, and she came to the forests of Arizona and wrote this wonderful article about our forests, describing them, and spent time at Camp number 1 describing the whole process. And her writing is just wonderful. So I'll be reading some quotes from that article as I continue. Starting off with, every forest has its logging methods. Growing out of local conditions in the Arizona forest, railroad track and flat cars take the place of rivers, flumes, splash dams, ice roads, and the like. Here's our photo of Camp 1, and she described it very, just so poetically. In a good many ways, the logging camp is as self-sufficient as the forest around it. The boxcar commissary furnishes the clothing and tobacco that are the necessities of life, and a few of its simple luxuries. They have a saying that it takes a lumberjack to cook for lumberjacks, and the long, clean car kitchen full of good smells is in command of a man who began at the saw. So there's our little cabins. You can see Main Street right there, the railroad track. There's that dining car or the cook car, the kitchen, and some of the kitchen help. And we've got, of course, breakfast on the hoof. A lot of men to feed, a lot of calories being burned out there. So these men were some of the best fed men in the area. People actually would ride the CARI out to have meals at at Camp 1. It was such a great meal that people made sure to go out there and do that on occasion. And there's that workforce. And this location here, they must have spent quite a bit of time there because they spent the time to even build a barn for all the horses. Again, another angle on the camp, and you can see the laundry hung to dry. This was an entire town. There was times that Camp 1 was large enough that it was its own voting district. And our steam donkey right in the middle of camp. It is a wholesome life, clean air, good food, all of the outdoors to live, and none of the dens of the devil that mar the mining camps. And at night, then the mystery and beauty of the forest closes in around the camp, like the sea around an island. The trees whisper together a different speech than by day. The big near stars seem tangled in the branches. They shine so clear and low. A cone falls, and the noise seems to echo back into the darkness. The air is loaded with balsam scents and the clean, sweet odor of new-cut wood. It is worth being a lumberjack by day to be a man in the forest by night. You got the water tank back there. You've got more of the cars for the operation, probably the commissary there. Oh, the work, that's the life in the camp. And now the work. Got some of the Men marking trees, getting ready. Notice no hard hats. This is a dangerous job. And obviously they would not be cutting 3 trees all at once in that close proximity. That's obviously a posed photo there. But Charlotte Hall again said, describing the whole process, 2 sawyers to a tree, the work begins. Axis first till a deep notch guides the fall of the tree, then the saw bites in diagonally, first on one side and then the other. And I'm going to stop my share and switch out to our video. We actually have some family movies. Sharing again. Okay, so back in the late 1920s, Mary and Bob Chambers, Mary being Tim and Caroline Riordan's oldest daughter, they bought a movie camera and they did take these silent film movies in a lot of different places, and they took it apparently out in the forest one day and took some video of the men. That's Tim Riordan walking by, and Mary. They're cutting that notch out. And no, this is not Tim and that gentleman actually cutting the tree. You can see that the saw is not actually hitting the wood. Now the real work is going to happen. Of course, everybody's got to walk through the screen, the camera there, including one of the family dogs. Look, back-breaking work. They were cutting it low to the ground to get as much useful wood out of the tree as they could. Everybody's starting to back up and get out of the way. Afterwards, the tree is down, and that is Bob Chambers and a friend trying their hand at the crosscut saw. Okay, I'm going to stop my share again, and I'll get back to the presentation. There you go. All right, so the tree has come down and the work begins. Each gang of sawyers carries a scaling stick. The trunk is marked off and cut 16 feet to the cut. And again, the saw burrs and sings, and so many cuts are reckoned toward the day's work. The axemen follow with their double-bitted axes, and under the swift strokes of the limbers, the limbs fall clean away from the trunk, and the tree has become saw logs waiting the skidders. The top, too small for the mill, will furnish a stull or 2 for the mines or ties for some distant railroad. When the stull makers and the tie cutters have finished their work, the branches will be dragged far enough away from all the small standing trees to ensure greater safety in case of forest fire. There's a Forest Service employee checking things off, making sure they're cutting the right trees, the right sizes. And of course, they do have to move those logs around. And here is some oxen. And you can see we have a cart here with the logs piled up. So they did use oxen at times. They also would use the horses, big draft horses, and just drag logs along. And they would use logging wheels. And we have a few sets of these logging wheels around town. We have a set here at the park at the entrance. And there was a set that used to welcome you into Flagstaff right by the lumber mill on Old 66 coming in from the west. And those logging wheels, one pair is over at the Pioneer Museum and one pair is at the Flagstaff Visitor Center. Our logging train. And Charlotte Hall did mention those logging wheels. She said, the big wheels, a single pair of very high wheels under which the logs are swung and skidded in with teams, are used here occasionally and almost entirely in other logging camps in the forest. Mentioned how they would sometimes go out, folks from town would sometimes go out to the camp and have a meal. Well, they would also go show off and pose on those logs. And of course, the steam donkey here. And this is basically a winch system with cable, a steam powered system. And they would use that cable to move the logs around. Ah, the spar tree. What an excitement here. The rigging of the spar tree is the most breath-stopping thing to be seen in the logging camp. The tree, 80 to 100 feet, swings in the wind, but the rigger climbs along, cutting off the branches as he goes, and at last chopping the crown square off, himself moored to the bare trunk with waist rope and climbing irons. As the crown falls, the trunk whips back and forth like a sapling, shaken by the leap of a wildcat. But the rigger whistles and sings as he fastens the pulleys a foot or two below the top and pulls the guy ropes and cables into place. 5 smaller cables anchored to the earth steady the tree. This is one of the photos from that magazine article, and obviously it's posed because you would not have people in these precarious and dangerous positions. You would not be hanging on to that tree while the logs were moving along. Another photo from that article. You see the steam donkey back there in the distance, the logging wheels. You get a good idea of the scale that you're dealing with and the size of these logs with the cables coming across this little canyon. When the skidder is fully rigged, roadways are cleared out into the timber from the foot of the spar tree and down these tracks. The logs can be dragged in from 1,600 feet in all directions. Around the skidder, the logs are piled in a great heap. You can see the logs piled up in some of those branches. The locomotive and a long string of log flats pull in with a short boxcar behind, out of whose open front a long crane reaches like the neck of an inquisitive ostrich. This is the steam log loader, the fit and worthy roadmate of the skidder and the locomotive. The engineer keeps his eye on the half-inch steel cable coiled over the drum ahead and drawn taut along the neck of the crane, on the levers, the logs, and his lumberjack assistants all at once. 2 men wait, one on the flat car with cant hook and one on the ground by the logs. The big boom swings out more than ever like the neck of some huge bird and drops a line of cable with a pair of steel log tongs at the end down to the man on the ground. He catches them deftly, opens the jaws, and with a quick swing clenches a log midway in bite of steel. The engine snarls, the boom swings up, and the log is lifted and poised over the flat car with wonderful precision. The man with the cant hook pushes and guides it, and it drops into place with scarcely a jar, though it may weigh a half-ton. Then the cable slackens, the steel tongs loosen, and the tireless boom swings out for another load. 3 men can load 50 cars in a day, 6 logs or more to the car, according to the size of the logs. Quite an operation. Now, this one here is from the Caddy Lumber Company, not the Arizona Lumber and Timber Company, but it's a great way to show how it was moved from one car to the next. Charlotte Hall continued, when a car is full, the engine spits and growls more fiercely, and the loader turns around and lifts itself back into position for another car. The pile of logs melts away, and the spar tree itself is felled and sawed into logs at the final cleanup. One of the largest trees cut in our forest. So impressive, they had to all stop and get a camera on that and pose with them all with it. Another photo from that article and showing what the forest looked like after they were done. You can see the piles out here, and this is done by Forest Service rules. She put on here, the brush from the tops piled at safe distance from growing trees, sufficient seed trees and all trees less than 14 inches diameter left standing. Brush piles will be burned with precautions against forest fires. She said in the article, it takes 2 or 3 months, according to the thickness of the timber, to log over a new camp. And meanwhile, the next set has been selected. So the Riordans were pretty conservative in their cutting habits. They were not clear cutting the forest. And actually, in 1893, Matt Reardon was very concerned with the responsible harvest of the timber resources. And he wrote a letter to the territorial governor, and it was later quoted in a report to the Secretary of the Interior. He said, "I believe that it is the duty of every person who can give the matter thought and who is in the position to influence anyone's action in the premises to make some endeavor to perpetuate our forest conditions for the benefit of future generations in the territory. Upon the rational use of our forests will depend the happiness and welfare, and I may say the absolute existence of any large population in this territory, and the time to act is present, when the least possible injury will be done to the vested rights. I believe the government ought to withdraw all timberlands it possesses and ought to appoint a competent forester who would make it his sole duty to see that the covering which nature has afforded our mountaintops should be preserved to the end that the valley land of the territory be protected either from droughts or floods in the years to come." Now, at this point in time, the Forest Service had not been formed. The forest reserves were just being created, and the Riordans and the Arizona Lumber and Timber Company were the only company on the scene. So there is arguments that Matt was kind of self-serving and wanted to protect his company's interests by having rules put in place before there was too much competition. So when they're done cutting in one area of the forest, they would load everything up and move into a new area. They'd pull up that track, lay it down into a new area. And as Charlotte Hall said, the log loader puff in on Main Street, grips the little bunk houses and swings them on, fully furnished as they stand, to the flat cars, and presently sets them down again in a primeval forest to repeat the story. The plucky, stubborn, blunt-nosed engines will swing the long string of flat cars piled high with logs with the sureness of an old cow horse turning a band of steers into the main herd. A pretty impressive sight to see these sections of railroad line that they built just to bring those trees in and would take apart and rebuild in other areas. It was too expensive to buy new steel for the track, so they would just reuse the track. The ties often were left out there in case they decided they needed to go back into an area and reuse a section, but they would reuse those same rails. And many of our Forest Service roads today are on some of these old railroad lines. And they were all over the forest. You can see from this map done by our former park manager, John Schreiber. He spent a lot of time looking at the logging railroads of the Coconino Kaibab National Forest book and created this map. And you can see the different areas they were working in different times. And you can also see that much of their work was on private land. It was on the railroad land, not on what became Forest Service land. All over the forest, you can see remnants of it. This area is out by Mormon Lake. Now let's move our operations into town. So that was out in the forest. So here in the town of Milton, this is now Reardon Road, and Route 66 runs right up here. You can see the office building labeled. This is on the corner of Reardon Road and 66. It is now the Pioneer Title Agency, also known as the Riordan Building. You can see what became the company hospital, the Milton Hospital or Mercy Hospital. It was also the home of Fred Sisson until 1908 when he passed away. He was one of their partners at the mill. And over here we have Tim Reardon and family's first home, and Michael and Elizabeth Reardon's first home right here, and the Reardon Mercantile and the mill in the background. Here is that close-up of the mill office and of the housing. So this is Milltown housing for the workers, also known as Las Chantes. Small little houses, company built, and they did have a small rent and payment for the key if you lived in one of those company houses. Another view, this view taken from the Riordan property. Riordan Mansion is the edge of the building right here. So right over in this area, now the Safeway Shopping Center. There's our Reardon Mercantile, the whole crowd of people hanging out in front, including some of the Reardon family members. You can buy just about anything you needed at the Reardon Mercantile. The Reardons did not pay their employees in script, so you could spend your money either at the Reardon Mercantile or go to downtown and spend it at the Babbitt store or the Brannan store. A view inside. Back in those days, you didn't just walk down the aisles and pick out what you wanted. You walked in with your list, and the staff at the store would pull your order for you. Okay, so back to the work. We've got the mill. So they've brought those logs in from the forest. They dump them into the mill pond. You can see the water here. The logs are floating. And by doing so, it would help knock off some of the dirt and rocks. And it would also make the logs damp. So when they went into the mill, the sawdust would clump and drop to the floor instead of being airborne, because sawdust is very combustible. You've got your guy here with a long stick guiding those logs up the conveyor belt and into the mill. Here they are in the mill making some of those first cuts. And notice the window here. It's at a diagonal. I'll show another picture of the mill from the outside. And these windows were done on a diagonal because when they were done vertically, the open windows would actually come down and slam closed because of all the vibrations in the building, and oftentimes the glass would break. So when they rebuilt the mill, they built the windows at a diagonal so that they wouldn't close. And so this is an open window. You can see the panes up here. So they'd get that ventilation into that space without the fear of glass breaking regularly. Another view of the planing mill where they would sand down the pieces of wood to get them ready for market. A view of some of our employees at the mill. You can see all the belts up here and systems for pulley belts for turning all the wheels. It was a steam powered plant. And the rules for working at the mill and of your employee guidelines, which is kind of cool. It talks about who is an employee. It talks about when they get their paycheck on the 20th day of each month. It talks about their medical fee, their health insurance, $1 where wages were $2 or over per day, 75 cents where wages are over $1.50 per day, and less than $2, 50 cents if your wages are $1 or less. You're not going to get charged twice in a month. You only get that once. And so they had a doctor on the payroll, and they also had, of course, Mercy or Milton Hospital, depending on the year, what it was called. And that they were taken care of. If they were hurt or injured, they were taken care of out of the company fund. And it was not uncommon if that company fund ran short that the Riordans would make up the difference. They had Milton houses, they had boarding houses, they had, of course, the houses out at the mill that their cost of that was taken out of their paycheck before they received it. And they were charged $1.50 for the key for their housing. Another view of the mill, you can see those diagonal or angled windows and some of the logs ready to be processed. And then, of course, after they're processed, stacked up in the lumber yards to dry. And here in our nice dry climate, they didn't kiln dry things. They just set it out in our lovely Arizona sun. And you'll notice things are set on an angle. That's for drainage. So when it did rain or snow, the water would run off. And the stacks, you can see, have space in between so that everything can dry and have good ventilation. Another view, got to have the guys on the piles for some scale and showing off the wood. You can see Mount Eldon in the background there, and Mars Hill here, the railroad track. And they made pretty much anything you could possibly make with pine. The Riordans really built the market for yellow pine, for ponderosa pine, and we're very proud of that fact, and fought for the claim that they built the market. But you can see that one of the big things they were doing was fruit packing boxes, building materials, some nice railing lumber there and trim work and mining timbers. Another view of one of the fairs that they went to, showing off some of the finer stuff with all the little trim work here. And I love pointing out this picture of the open forest. That's I showed it earlier in the presentation. They were very proud of their employees. They said, the Arizona Lumber and Timber Company controls more timber and better timber, has more facilities and better facilities, employs more men, and we believe better ones, turns out better material and more of it, quotes more prices and better prices than any other concern on the line of the Santa Fe between Chicago and the Pacific Seas. And they'd show off that pride every year with the 4th of July. The Flagstaff still has our 4th of July parade where businesses show off their products and their pride and their patriotism. And here is one of the Arizona Lumber and Timber Company floats with boughs of pine, of course, and some fence pickets and fruit packing boxes. And of course, 4th of July was a good time to show off other things as well. Here is the Milton hose cart team in competition. I believe they won that year. The hose carts, that was their firefighting teams, and they would practice lots of times to make sure that they were ready to respond when there was a fire, and they would have competitions between the different teams around town. Here's that view of what welcoming you to Flagstaff on 66. There's those logging wheels I mentioned, bringing you into town. The mill over here. Wonderful postcard taken from the photo taken from Mars Hill, looking down on the mill and all those lumber yards. By 1933, Michael Riordan had passed away. Matt Riordan had left Flagstaff long before, selling out to his younger brothers. And here we have the article talking about Tim selling. He sells his controlling interest in the mill to Joe Dolan. And why? He was time to retire. He's 75 years old. He wanted to spend time with those lovely granddaughters of his. 1963, fire started in the lumber yard and the mill burned, and Dolan decided not to rebuild at that time. Instead, Arizona Lumber and Timber Company found themselves in the real estate business, selling off the different areas of the land there, including this section here. This is what it looks like right now under construction. We have the student housing complex here, the Standard, and a hotel and spa being renovated. There's your view of Route 66 back then and what it looks like today. The Arizona Lumber and Timber Company office building when it was built in 1901 and what it looks like today. And a few of the other buildings that are still there. We have the 1914, the Koch family home was built. I.B. Koch was a mill supervisor, and now it is the Remax Realty office. They did a beautiful job restoring that building. And of that view of Reardon Road from 1911 and it today. And I do believe that's the same ponderosa pine there next to Walgreens. And thank you so much for your time today. Lots of people have helped with research over the years and have taken their turn at giving this presentation. So a little shout out to all of them. Thank you so much for your time today and hope to see you here at the park